Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your daily sit rep for Tuesday, the 20th of January, 2026. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Robert, good morning. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. There's a lot to cover today, and I'll let you take it away. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mike. So House Republican leaders are attempting to finalize a set of must-pass spending bills, and this is because they're scheduled to take a recess next week. They are still facing that 31 January deadline to avert a partial government shutdown. Right now, Republicans and Democrats are fighting over demands to curtail ICE operations in the Homeland Security funding bill. As far as I can see, both Republican and Democrat leadership are publicly stating they want to avoid another shutdown fight, but there have been parts of the Democratic Party, especially progressives and activists, who are pushing Democrats to force another shutdown over ICE funding. And it is possible that they pressure Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer to attempt another partial shutdown again, which is what they did last October. For now, though, I think a government shutdown on the 31st of January is unlikely for now. Moving over to the domestic side, independent journalist Andy No said that some right-wing counter-protesters had disrupted a planned Rose City Antifa direct action. This was the one we reported on last week, that they were planning a demonstration in front of the home of an alleged ICE employee in Portland. The video that was published that showed that these counter-protesters did deter this direct action demonstration, but I don't think this is the end of these demonstrations that are targeting the homes of federal agents, because as we previously reported, some of the far left groups involved in anti-ICE operations were instrumental in identifying strategic choke points for disrupting federal immigration surges. I think they also see this as a key strategy for disrupting the Trump administration's capacity.
Mm-hmm. Robert, on that point, one of the reasons why we saw a die down in Antifa activity back in 2021, there was a couple of very important things that happened. One of them was really the absence of conservative or right-wing street action. You go back to 2015, actually, starting with these white nationalist groups. And, Richard Spencer had that college campus tour and he ended up canceling it because they were just being accosted everywhere they went. They went to Michigan State and Florida, Auburn, maybe another college campus or two. But anyway, everywhere they went, there was this massive Antifa presence and street fights and, stuff that we saw on the news. And that lasted from 2015, 16, 17, and of course it grew just to Trump's assault on random Trump supporters as well. But one reason why that died down in 2021 is because there was really no more Proud Boys street action. There was no more Patriot Prayer street action. Trump rallies and these kinds of events were no longer taking place, and so it kind of removed some surface area for basically attack for Antifa. So we talk about will right-wing counter demonstrations increase like we saw previously, and I think there's a good case that they will. And if they do, then maybe this is something that reanimates Antifa. We've previously covered a lot of reasons why they have been dormant and really not rising to the level that we saw back in. I would even say today, these anti-ICE demonstrations, even though there has been violence, I still don't think it's risen to the volume that we saw back in 2017. I think there was far more civil unrest back in 2017. And a lot of this ICE stuff really is confined to, half a dozen cities or so. And it's not as widespread, I don't think, as it was in 2017. At any rate, moving forward, if we do see conservative and right-wing pro-Trump, pro-ICE groups get back out onto the street to hold rallies in support of ICE or demonstrations, there's maybe a good case to be made that we do get back to that 2017, 18, 19, eventually 2020 level of unrest. Is that what you're seeing? Let me ask you this. How likely do you think it is that more right-wing groups come out and counter-protest or hold these rallies or demonstrations?
I think it's becoming more likely. I think there's a lot of frustration with the Trump administration. So Assistant Attorney General Harmeet Dillon, they announced that there are investigations ongoing in some of these demonstrations that have been happening and some of the violence, because there are videos coming out of Minneapolis of just regular people walking down the street being accosted by activists because they believe they're undercover ICE agents or because they're wearing jackets with American flags on it. There have been in Minneapolis, there was Nick Lang, who is famous for doing the anti-Islam marches in Michigan. He attempted a similar protest and was beaten by some of these anti-ICE activists. And I think there is a growing frustration among the more politically activated right over what they see as maybe not inaction, but slow action by the Trump administration on this. And I think that's going to spur some more people into doing counter protests.
Mhm. Well, that's exactly what happened in Portland and some of these other places is that you did have conservative and right wing groups like Patriot Prayer get tired of seeing Antifa of these of street action and these direct action demonstrations, and then come out and hold their own events and counter demonstrate. So I think this is a fair point, great observation, and it is something that everyone listen. The reason why everyone should be doing their area study is because this stuff is going to get worse, and there's a good chance that it gets far worse before it gets any better. And of course, 2028 again is shaping up to potentially be 27, 28, 29, potentially another cataclysmic period in U.S. history. Everybody should be doing their area study and specifically focusing on the local social and political landscape. Identify these groups now. Do you have radical and revolutionary left-wing groups in your area? Do you have right-wing groups that could engage in street action or some demonstrations of their own in your area? In a lot of cases, I'll just talk about my area. I live in an extremely red county, and it was not until October of last year that I realized that we had a revolutionary party here, and this party exists in other parts of the country. I did not realize that they were here until they were at the No Kings protest back in October, No Kings 2.0, and they're handing out literature. And so go out. This is another reason why everyone should go out to these protests and see which groups are out there, because this stuff is going to be on the test. If you're trying to look at your area and do an assessment and look at the likelihood or look at potential problems that may arise in your area, if you have left-wing groups and you have right-wing groups that both show a propensity to get out on the street, you're probably going to have, you're very likely to have conflict, and it may rise to the level of armed conflict potentially as well. So this is something that everybody should be keeping an eye on. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on.
So in Washington, D.C. last week, a man who pointed or allegedly pointed a laser at Marine One while President Trump was aboard was acquitted by a D.C. jury. And this incident happened last September. The public defenders that were representing this man said the jury deliberated for only 35 minutes before they returned their not guilty verdict. I think this is likely the outcome of some of these jury nullification training activists have been holding. These two groups, Free DC and another one called Harriet's Wildest Dreams, have been using this, what they call their Juror Information Project, to teach skeptical jurors, effectively teaching activists about jury nullification. They've been holding these trainings for almost a year now. The stated goal of this project is to, quote, protect people with marginalized identities. I think this is basically a cover for action to use jury nullification in an attempt to disrupt the Trump administration. In this case, someone directly targeting Marine One with a laser. The DOJ announced that they are considering charges for that Minneapolis church protest that happened over the weekend. This is coming from Assistant Attorney General Harmeet Dillon. She said they're considering using the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act to charge some of the protesters in that incident. And according to Dillon, the FBI is investigating the protest. This is important because the FACE Act was used by the Biden administration to arrest people praying in front of or near abortion clinics during his administration. And this is a new legal lever that the Trump administration appears to be using to go after the anti-ICE resistance. I do expect more of these types of demonstrations targeting churches during services. And because Don Lemon, the former journalist who appeared to be part of the organization of this protest, said on camera that the point of this is to make people uncomfortable. And I think they are seeking acquiescence from conservatives as part of this new tactic that I think they're going to adopt.
Robert, it seems to me that, and I saw a couple of people maybe mention this in the chat as well, about the potential for this move to backfire, because I do think this the protest at the church where they came in and they disrupted a church service. It is a I'm not sure if it's a felony. I imagine it could be a felony. There was some talk about DOJ maybe charging Don Lemon under the Ku Klux Klan Act, basically saying that these protesters violated the civil rights of this Christian worship service at this church, which I think is a fair point, and frankly, the DOJ should do that. But on the other hand, I saw where a lot of churches, I saw some pastors talking about it and speaking out about it, and a friend of mine, actually a fraternity brother who's now a pastor of a church, he's kind of played both sides of this ICE thing. He does a few videos a week, and I watch him, and more recently he has really come out. He is obviously conservative, but come out not necessarily in support of ICE, but really taking a hard tone against the left. And I think there is a certain radicalizing factor here where you have more or less normies or people who have been on the bubble, either not wanting to take a side, but now they're looking at these disruptive protests targeting churches or potentially in the future. And I think that's probably a strategic error on behalf of these left-wing groups.
Yeah, I agree. I think it has the potential to galvanize a lot more people to support the Trump administration against this anti-ICE resistance. However, I do think for some of these, especially the activists, there's one guy that was involved in this incident, who apparently has made appearance in other areas, like he was in DC last year, and he put out a video after the incident, basically daring the Trump administration to come after him. I think for some of these activists, they would not mind the galvanization of a more conservative, even if it was a normie conservative backlash, because for some of them it is about the action. But for some of the more mainstream people getting involved in the protests, there's a potential for backlash, and maybe even a situation where the Trump administration response does deter some of the more casual protesters of becoming more involved with some of these demonstrations, especially if this does become a TTP that's adopted by these anti-ICE groups.
Mm-hmm. Robert, I would add to that. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a power vacuum, but one reason why I think you are seeing a right-wing or conservative response to this, or we're on maybe the beginning edge of this, is because many conservatives feel that not enough is being done to combat these left-wing street acts or street actions, demonstrations, and in order to protect ICE agents. And this is something where obviously the Trump administration has been hung up in the courts and harangued through the legal process. But I see this and I know that social media and X is not real life. Just in terms of identifying sentiment, what we call atmospherics, the atmospherics are looking like a lot of conservatives want Trump to lay the hammer down. And I would say every day that he does not, I think we're going to see there's a good chance we see an increase in these, right-wing counter demonstrations here. Even coming out, and we have seen a number of these armed left-wing. Did you see that guy who was standing out in Minneapolis with an AR-15 slung across his chest?
I did.
Yeah. Basically, that's an attempt at intimidating federal agents. Obviously, probably not like the smartest thing to do, but I'm sure he thinks that's the smart or the right thing to do. At any rate, this is not ending anytime soon. I think there's a very good chance that ICE probably changes some of their tactics. Like I saw one video where ICE was out early in the morning at like 5 or 6 or 7 a.m., basically before protesters could get out there, and they were conducting these operations. And, so maybe we see something a little bit like that. But at any rate, Robert, anything else to add there?
Well, they have changed the way that they're approaching these federal surges because of the rapid response groups, basically smaller raids within the larger operations. So like in Metro Surge, having a smaller footprint so that they can move more quickly and prevent these rapid response groups from getting large crowds of people gathered to, attempt arrests. However, Todd Lyons did come out and say that right now they have gone from something like 2 to 3 agents per arrest in order to maintain security to 13 to 15 agents per arrest. So some of this rapid response activity is disrupting that strategy change a little bit, and maybe that I think that might explain why one of the reasons the Trump administration has surged so many agents into Minneapolis is to be able to maintain their own security without being able to deploy the National Guard.
Mm-hmm. Robert, last point, we'll move on. Did you see that case? And it was on a video, and I imagine this did happen. I obviously can't say for sure that it did, but there was this claim where ICE agents who were being followed by these observers, these left-wing observers, the ICE agents got the plate numbers of these vehicles and looked up the drivers and where they lived, and then instead of driving to where, and maybe they were acting as a decoy, obviously, but they drove back to the home of where that vehicle was registered, and it apparently freaked out some of the observers.
I did see that, and there have been multiple instances that I saw over the weekend where there was even a 911 call to the Minneapolis dispatch, apparently, where they said that where they outlined that the federal agents had led them back to their own home and basically said on the loudspeaker that, hey, we know where you live, just go home.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anything else on the slide, Robert?
Oh, and then the DOJ is investigating, apparently, Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey as part of this ongoing investigation into officials impeding federal law enforcement. They issued a subpoena on Friday, and they are investigating them under a federal law that prohibits conspiracy to impede a federal investigation. This is an important part of the investigative process, is legal discovery process and subpoenas to target communications. I believe that's what they're doing. Because I did see over the weekend, there was allegedly one of the Minnesota assistant attorney generals is in these anti-ICE activist group chats, and they are offering support for activists that are detained or arrested. Specifically, they want them to avoid official communications, to avoid what the assistant attorney general said, creating data on communications. So they're sending them their signal chat number, basically. And I think the point here is to avoid scrutiny for activists and officials' communications, because like Midway Blitz, there are local Democrats. They're the Democrat Farmer Labor Party officials and political operatives involved in these anti-ICE rapid response groups in Minneapolis. And I think they're trying to avoid potential charges for impeding ICE.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seemed to me like conspiracy and potentially even RICO charges should be on the table. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to our global sit rep. Jared, good morning. Starting off here, I think, is Jared, I'm not sure if Jared cut out or not. All right, well, let's go ahead and move on here.
There we go.
All right, Jared, there you go. I think we had an internet gremlin. All right, go ahead.
All right, so we're going to start off tariffs over Greenland. President Trump announced a 10% tariff starting on February 1st for several European nations. The full list is in the report for opposing the U.S. acquisition of Greenland, and that's going to kick up to 25% on June 1st if a deal is not reached for what he said was the complete and total purchase of Greenland. Now, the nations in question did release a joint statement condemning the tariffs and acknowledging, hey, the military exercise going on in Greenland right now between us is not related to these. It was pre-planned. I think ultimately this will end up moving forward. Going down to South America, the Guatemalan president, Arevalo, announced a 30-day state of siege in Guatemala after reestablishing control over 3 prisons lost to gangs over the weekend. Now, during the state of siege, Guatemala is going to use the full force of the state to combat numerous gangs, including the Barrio 18 gang, which just last year was designated a terrorist organization by the United States. I do think that's the most important detail here. The U.S. is not currently providing support for the state of siege and the counter gang activity, but being that this is a foreign terrorist organization, and we have assets in the region, and the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is fully in effect. I could see us potentially getting involved, probably only at Guatemala's behest, though, not without their request. Moving a little bit farther south to Colombia, the president there said he was canceling his planned trip to the World Economic Forum, which is going on this week, in order to concentrate all government efforts on preparing for his meeting with President Trump on the 3rd of February. And this is abnormal for most heads of state. Normally they go out of their way to attend the WEF, not to avoid the WEF in favor of another head of state. Then moving even further south into Peru, the State Department is requesting congressional approval to build up the build up a naval base down there in Lima. And this program is a foreign military sale for $1.5 billion, so Peru will be paying for it. It's going to use U.S. government and contractor engineering, and will, quoting, accommodate current and future naval and logistical operations and requirements. Now, this naval base overlooks the Chancay megaport that the Chinese run out of Lima. I've got both of them on the map here, but they're so close they actually overlap quite a bit. I think what's happening here, considering that the naval base in question already houses a U.S. Navy medical team, I think they're prepared, and the specific accommodation is not only for the Peruvian Navy. I think the U.S. is preparing to make frequent port visits here, not establishing a permanent presence, but establishing a port rotation here in order to keep an eye on that trade route and potentially intervene if we need to on short notice. And then lastly, the British government approved a Chinese embassy in London this morning, and this is ahead of Prime Minister Keir Starmer's visit to China. The embassy was previously denied. It's been denied for 8 years now, on the grounds that it would serve as an espionage base for China in the UK and Europe, and I believe it overlooks the Ministry of Defense there as well. I find the timing highly suspicious, and frankly, I think between this and Canada's announcement of a new strategic partnership, the United States will likely take a hard look at the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement, because two of its most important partners are now cozying up with China. And that means the U.S. will likely look for a new premier partnership.
Yeah, Jared, I think that's a great point. And this is something, and we will talk about what Ray Dalio said here in just a few minutes, but Ray Dalio says, like, it's now happening. All this talk about the breakdown of the international order and these international organizations like NATO and the intelligence sharing agreements among Five Eyes. He doesn't say that specifically, but we can include that in the breakdown of the international geopolitical order, or rules-based international order. He and many others have said it is breaking down, and we are seeing that in real time. All right, thanks for that, Jared. Let's move on. Robert, let's bring you back on to talk about Metro Surge and the latest. If you would, briefly, we'll talk about Homeland Ops, and then we'll move on to Ray Dalio.
So the DoD ordered 1,500 troops from the Alaska-based 11th Airborne Division to prepare to deploy to Minnesota. This is in case violence escalates during these ongoing demonstrations. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry said the Trump administration is attempting to bait anti-ICE demonstrators into escalating violence to justify deploying troops. The Trump administration has signaled preparations for invoking the Insurrection Act, though I think Fry might be correct that this is an attempt to apply more pressure to Minnesota officials to support these federal operations. However, this is a likely indicator that the Trump administration is preparing to follow through with invoking the Insurrection Act. The FBI is also asking for volunteers to deploy to Operation Metro Surge, and the Minnesota National Guard has been activated. And according to the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, they are staging in Minneapolis to support law enforcement and emergency management operations. I did think it was interesting that they specifically said that National Guard troops will, quote, support the rights of all who assemble peacefully. There's a potential here, as Governor Tim Walz said, that or hinted at a few weeks ago, that the Minnesota National Guard may be deployed to impede ICE operations. However, I think that's unlikely, just due to the potential for the Trump administration to leverage the Uniform Code of Military Justice and to federalize National Guard troops if there is any kind of confrontation. Also, there were some hotels that announced they were closing indefinitely, or at least as long as Operation Metro Surge goes on. And reportedly, these two hotels in St. Paul, Minnesota, were housing ICE agents. They cited some safety concerns. I think this is the result of some of these anti-ICE activists attempting to chip away at federal capacity. And I think it's likely the result of threats and activist direct action demonstrations that have been targeting these hotels. And finally, in Maine, there's an independent journalist, Steve Robinson, who published a letter from the U.S. Marshal Service that says that Maine's Bureau of Motor Vehicles has informed federal agencies that they will no longer issue confidential undercover vehicle registrations to any federal agencies. Robinson has said that this is ahead of what he called a rumored federal surge in the state. I've not seen any talk of a Maine federal surge, but the administration has been conducting smaller surges under what they call Operation at Large. And so this could be preparations for an unannounced smaller operation in Maine. I think, like some of the other states, the likely intent here from Maine officials is to facilitate some of these anti-ICE activist operations, because they have been doing it in other states like Illinois, either directly involved in rapid response groups or indirectly supporting anti-ICE operations through local and state legislation.
Mm-hmm. Robert, did DHS previously say that they were going to end the practice of these large named surge operations and instead, I guess, fairly quietly push out ICE agents to these places in more of a persistent presence rather than a surge operation?
That was talk that came out of the end of last year. And I think the result of that was this Operation at Large.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then let's talk about the National Guard here. Previously, you said that if Governor Tim Walz there in Minnesota did activate or did call up and actually deploy the National Guard, not just issue a warning order, that the Trump administration could then come in, President Trump could come in, and because of the federal supremacy clause, activate the National Guard on Title 10 orders and to put them under federal control?
That correct. And that's it, because there were multiple press conferences where Walz said things like, "We as state has never been at war with the federal government before." He's hinted that he was planning to deploy the National Guard to as effectively a buffer between these direct action demonstrators and ICE. And if there was a conflict, I think the Trump administration would activate the National Guard, because that has happened in the past during conflicts between state and federal government. Like with the desegregation and during the civil rights era, LBJ, Eisenhower would the states would deploy National Guard troops, and basically as a counter to new federal laws and federal case law. And the president at the time activated the National Guard. I'm pretty sure LBJ did it as well, where they would activate the National Guard, send them back to their depots, and then deploy federal troops. And I think that's the course of action the Trump administration would take if Walz ordered National Guard to step in between federal agents and these direct action demonstrations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And then potentially under the Insurrection Act, one thing I had said that I doubted the Insurrection Act. Well, with one caveat, I tended to doubt that President Trump would invoke the Insurrection Act in Minneapolis prior to the midterms, because I think the political calculus is there that it would potentially harm vulnerable Republicans heading into the midterms. And obviously President Trump cannot allow to lose the Republican House majority, for what little purpose it serves currently as a majority. But thinking about this on a longer scale, I've been talking about everything we're seeing now. If you put this in a proper context, not just the protests, but the direct action demonstrations, what we refer to as organized resistance, that is phase 2. Organized resistance is phase 2 of this color revolution 3-phase strategy. And it goes from protest, that's your bedrock, that's your activist base that you have to mobilize for a number of reasons. I've talked about it many times on the show. And then there's going to be a certain portion of those protesters who want to do more. So you push them up into the next rung of the escalation ladder, which is organized resistance, which is what we're seeing now. Direct intervention, trying to block ICE and impede ICE operations. And then in 2028, coinciding with the election, you would have this culminating phase of a color revolution, which is the actual revolution part. So being that it is going to be, we still have, 3+ years of this. One, at a strategic level, I wonder if President Trump and the administration are not more likely to impose the Insurrection Act in an effort to exhaust this movement before they get to the 28 elections. And I'm not saying necessarily that they will, but if I were advising the president, this is a strategy that is worth looking at, because I actually do think this movement could be exhausted. I don't think they have what it takes to do this for 3 years. The federal government does. And now, of course, the midterms and Republican control of the House notwithstanding. And I'm not, Robert, you're the politics and governance guy. I'm not exactly clear on how Democrat control of the House could effectively stop ICE. Just briefly, what's your take on that?
Well, I think the political calculus for the Trump administration has changed because the Democrats are unlikely to flip the Senate. Just the map they're facing means that Republicans are likely to hold on a majority, which means what they could do in the short term is articles of impeachment. They're already talking about that, but that wouldn't fit. They could pass it in the House, but it wouldn't get a conviction in the Senate. The other thing they could do is refuse to pass a continuing resolution after they take power in January 2027 in the House, or any kind of spending bills to cause a government shutdown. But as far as these federal operations go, that they're already funded. That's what DHS Secretary Noem has said, and gotten a win in court on blocking these unannounced oversight visits from Democrats, that they're funded under the big beautiful bill, and that funds them until 2028. So I don't think there are a lot of options that Democrats would find tasteful, because there is a lot of resistance to using government shutdowns for this, and that's probably their only leverage.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a key assumption is Democrats would be limited in any kind of congressional action to block ICE operations.
They could also do things like, so they could hold oversight hearings in the House and request and then demand the appearance of Trump officials. And then if with the idea of taking leadership away from these operations, if they did that and the officials refused to show up, well, they could hold them in contempt of Congress, but then requires the DOJ to arrest Trump officials. Mm-hmm. That's another avenue they could take. I think that would end up becoming a major point of conflict between the administration and the Democratic Congress.
Mm-hmm. All right, so leadership can be delegated. I'm sure a lot of these ICE and customs field offices can run independently for at least a day, I would hope. All right, so at any rate, the overall picture here potentially is ICE operations are sustainable. There's a case to be made that maybe over the next 3 years, just having to go out there day after day and facing arrest for obstruction and facing prison sentences is not going to be sustainable. For months, sure. For 3 years, I don't know. It really seems to me like they could really exhaust this movement. So maybe this is a consideration here. If you're at the White House and you say, as soon as what's happening in Minneapolis, I also think that there's some question about whether what's happening in Minneapolis actually legally rises to the legal definition of insurrection. And I'm not sure that it has. But once it does invoke the Insurrection Act, and I'm sure the administration is going to have to invoke the Insurrection Act in multiple other cities as well. If they do it in Minneapolis, my assumption is that they're going to be forced to do it potentially forced into doing it in other cities as well. But if you can do this for 3 years, I actually think that they will exhaust the movement. And if they do, then maybe, well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. But I think that has to be a potential course of action here as well. Anything to add, Robert?
So I think what's going to happen here, because the president has a lot of discretion in defining what is an insurrection, and effectively it means that the local and federal forces cannot effectively enforce the law. And I think if the Trump administration does follow through, it's obviously going to go to a court case. There's going to be a legal fight over it. But there is the potential the Trump administration prevails, even going up to the Supreme Court with the argument that by these states and cities ordering their officials not to support ICE operations, not to not respond as Hennepin County and Minneapolis PD have not done to some of these direct action demonstrations, that does create the precedent or a situation that justifies invoking the Insurrection Act. One of the outcomes here could be either the Trump administration has that justification for more of these sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, or officials in states that are softer on this do start support, at least not interfering with ICE operations and not allowing some of these demonstrations to continue, these direct action demonstrations to continue without any kind of response, with the idea that they don't want the Trump administration to invoke the Insurrection Act in their city. And that's what I think one potential outcome of this is, that there is a divide between local and state different local and state Democrat officials, with one side who does double down on opposing the Trump administration in their use of the Insurrection Act, and another side of less blue areas and saw like states that don't have a Democrat governing trifecta that are a lot more open to at least not disrupting federal operations.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Lots more to come. And by the way, for those of you who are new around here, we do this briefing every day, Monday through Friday. And if you're joining us here for the first time, this is what we talk about. These are the kinds of things that we talk about every day. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on here. 238 protests today. I started clipping the daily protest map because it's pretty much noise, but this is far beyond. This is probably 5 times roughly what's normal for a Tuesday. It's actually, let's call it 6 times what's normal for a Tuesday. If you see a yellow dot on the map and it is near you, we track these protests every day. Head over to our website, log in at forwardobserver.com. If you'd like to start a free 7-day trial, head over to forwardobserver.com/trial and check out our map where we're tracking these protests, and go get the time and location of this protest and try to make it out there and just observe. You should do that to see which radical and revolutionary groups are showing up to these events, which means that they are operational in your area. They're out there recruiting and building the human infrastructure and likely training the cadres that you're going to see later this spring and summer and into the years to come, obviously. All right, now let's go ahead and move on here and talk about Ray Dalio. In a post yesterday, legendary hedge fund manager Ray Dalio wrote that the existing fiat monetary order, the domestic political order, and the international geopolitical order are all breaking down. Here's what he said exactly, quote, "It's now happening. The existing fiat monetary order, the domestic political order, and the international geopolitical order are all breaking down, so we are at the brink of war. It is all happening because of the big cycle that is driven by the 5 big forces." And just for your awareness, those 5 big forces are the big debt cycle, the breakdown of the internal order, the breakdown of the external order, acts of nature, and technology. And I want to focus on those first 3 because these are the first 3 that are cyclical. I started following Ray Dalio almost exactly 10 years ago, back in 2016. During the World Economic Forum, Ray Dalio was on a CNBC interview, and he was there in Davos, Switzerland, speaking of the WEF, starting this week. And he was telling the interviewer that he thought the United States was headed for a civil war. And he didn't put any kind of time on it, but if I recall correctly, he basically said, look, it's not imminent. But later he would make the case that it was breaking down, this conflict was breaking down largely between capitalists versus socialists. And that is something that we saw back, 16 to 18, you had the Bernie Sanders wave and DSA leading to AOC and the squad. And DSA's had a rough couple of years. Democratic Socialists of America as a party has had a rough couple of years. But there absolutely is still this strong undercurrent of quote-unquote democratic socialism that exists on the left. And I think Ray Dalio would say that this conflict is still largely breaking down between capitalists and socialists. And so after that interview, I said, well, this is interesting. And I started researching him, Ray Dalio, and reading about his hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates. And for a long time, is the world's largest and for years, the world's most successful hedge fund. So in other words, Ray Dalio has been adept at making bets with billions of dollars of other people's money. And this is in an industry where performance is measurable, and bad hedge fund managers do not last very long. And so since 2016, I've read 4 of Ray Dalio's books. Principles, which is basically like a success book. But the 3 here on your screen are Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises, crises, which was published in 2018. Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, subtitled Why Nations Succeed and Fail, published in 2021. And finally, Why Countries Go Broke, which was published last year. And so these 3 books have really focused on the big picture challenges that the United States is facing as Ray Dalio sees them. And he really paints this picture that there are 3 forces that are more or less cyclical in that they can be measured, and that you can form expectations of the future based on where the United States is in each of these cycles. And so the first one is the overall big debt cycle, which lasts about 80 years. And this is an average, so some last shorter, some are longer, but this is based on 45 modern debt cycles. And there's a whole chapter. If you're interested, if you're like a math and statistics nerd, this is a great book, because Ray Dalio goes into very boring, excruciating detail. But he does he makes the case very well, I would say. And these big debt crises, these cycles, have 5 phases. All these cycles start off with hard money. It is money backed by something, gold or silver, historically. And then you move to a fiat system that's driven by interest rates. And then that becomes inadequate for managing your money. And so you move to you increase debt monetization, which is you just print money and you create debt so that you have more money. And then you get to the next phase, which is a fiat system with both debt monetization and a big fiscal deficit, which means you're spending far more money than you have revenue coming in. And then that can last a long time, but it eventually ends in a big deleveraging crisis. And those can be inflationary or hyperinflationary. Those could be deflationary. And Ray Dalio talks about what's going to happen to the U.S. is probably going to be inflationary or hyperinflationary. And Dalio believes the United States is currently in this 4th phase, about to transition to the 5th phase, which is the final phase. And in this book, he says there's an 80% chance that the United States is going to experience this final crisis phase within the next 10 years. And this was published last year. So he makes this prediction in this last book here, How Countries Go Broke. And by the way, if you're an early warning member, I have a 10-page book, chapter by chapter book summary there for you. You can download the PDF and read through my notes. That's the first big cycles, the overall big debt cycle, which he says we're nearing an end in the next 10 years. And then there's the cycle of internal order and disorder. This is cyclical. This is the domestic political cycle that runs from peace to conflict and then eventually back to peace. And then you have the cycle of external order and disorder. And this is a cycle of geopolitical harmony and conflict. And really, we're talking about world orders. And this picture right here is based off of Ray Dalio's second book, which is Principles for Navigating the Changing World Order. And you start off with a new world order. And in this case, we're looking at the post-1945 rules-based international order. And you go through this period of prosperity. Of course, we were taking off the gold system back in the 70s. And so we moved from hard money to a fiat system based on interest rates, and then a fiat system based on debt monetization, and then a fiat system with both debt monetization and a big fiscal deficit. And that's where we are. And that's why we have this debt bubble. And Ray Dalio in this book talks about all of these. Anytime you go from a hard money to a fiat system, this inevitably happens. It's human nature. These governments will just overspend, and they'll print money so they can overspend. And that creates a lot of wealth and prosperity, but you cannot blow up this balloon forever. It will eventually pop. And so you get this big wealth gap. So we talk about income inequality and wealth inequality and the K-shaped economy, where if you're in the top 10 or 25%, your portfolio is looking really great. If you're in the bottom 50%, your economic situation is looking a lot tougher. And so this bubble continues to blow up until you get a debt bust. And based off of what Ray Dalio has been saying for the past 5 years or so, I've circled where we probably are. So we are obviously well after the big debt bubble, but we have not quite gotten to the debt bust. And that could still be some years away. I mean, potentially that could be 10 or more years away. It could be 10 months away. I don't think anyone really knows exactly when this is going to happen, but we can look for indicators, and that's what I do every Friday in the Economic Early Warning Report. Eventually, you do have this debt bust. And for the United States, it's going to be inflationary because we are obviously going to print our way out of this. And it's going to be devastating for savers, for people on fixed income, for senior citizens, for people who have jobs that have wages that don't keep up with the pace of inflation. It's going to be disastrous. And we know this because we can look at all of the cycles where this has happened before. At any rate, you get a big debt bust. And if you are leading the world order, which the United States has since roughly 1945, you have to print more money because you have larger outlays. You have to spend more money because of inflation. $1 million today will not buy $1 million worth of goods and services tomorrow because of inflation. So you have to print more money to keep up. And so the United States is going to be forced into this. And if you think we've seen money printing now, we haven't seen anything yet. There's going to be a lot more money printed. There has to be. We're $38 trillion in debt. There's over $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. We're going to afford that, but we're going to have to print trillions and trillions of dollars before we do. Your dollar is going to be worth a lot less in the future. It already has been compared to even 5-10 years ago. And then you get into revolutions and wars, which lead to debt and political restructuring. I think Ray Dalio makes this case lightly, but I'll just spell it out for you. The best case scenario for the future of the United States is that we have a debt restructuring. Basically, a lot of people are going to take a haircut, and the Treasury is going to say, well, we're only going to pay you back 75%, or we're only going to pay you 50% of treasuries that you held. And of course, they're going to print money to pay to meet that obligation when that debt matures. And so that's called a haircut. That's a bond haircut. So bondholders are going to be in massive amounts of pain. That's why, frankly, I think that's why many reasons why China has stopped buying 30-year treasuries, and why a lot of countries have really looked at 30-year treasuries and said, maybe that's not a great place to put our money. At any rate, the flip side of that is you get political restructuring, which means new governments, which means potentially balkanization of the United States. Maybe we do break into different regions. It's hard to say exactly what will happen, but that's what debt and political restructuring could look like. And then finally, you have this new world order. And Ray Dalio previously said that's going to be China. China is going to be the new world order. And, you read the national security strategy, and it's pretty clear what's going on. The Trump administration is trying to prepare the United States for this transition from the existing world order to the next world order. And we are seeing it crumble in front of our eyes. So Dalio believes that these three main cycles are ending simultaneously. And that's the overall big debt cycle, and then the internal cycle, and then the external cycle as well. And he says that's leading to the breakdown of the U.S. monetary order, U.S. domestic order, and the U.S.-led international order. And it's really difficult to say that he's wrong because we are seeing substantial strain on all three. We talk about this stuff virtually every day on the show and in our reports that we publish and send out to subscribers every morning. So as for Ray Dalio's prediction that the world is on the brink of war, I will talk about another book, an excellent book, and called Economic Interdependence and War. And the main conclusion there is that negative trade expectations between economically interdependent great powers actually ends in war nearly 90% of the time. So there are 30 case studies in this book. 26 out of 30 times this has ended in war. And I'll just say this again. You have great powers like the United States and China, and they have heretofore been economically interdependent. And when one side or the other, or both, develop negative trade expectations of the future, that results in war 90% of the time. And I'll give you a direct quote from this author, which is John Copeland. And again, this is a fantastic book. If you want to understand what the next 10 to 20 years is going to look like, this book is absolutely required reading. At any rate, John Copeland writes, quote, "When great powers have positive expectations of the future trade environment, they want to remain at peace in order to secure the economic benefits. When, however, these expectations turn negative, leaders are likely to fear loss of access to raw materials and markets, giving them an incentive to initiate crises in order to protect their commercial interests. And that's probably where we are. So there may be a tendency for some also to blame President Trump for this. And you read all of these authors, especially Ray Dalio, and he's adamant that these events that we're seeing, they're cyclical, meaning that they were always going to happen. And I think Dalio would argue that one influential person, like a president, like President Trump, could extend or hasten the end of any of these cycles. But that one person is not going to stop the cycle. They're cyclical for a reason. And so it seems to me more likely than not that the Trump administration understands that this external order has already been breaking down. And it looks to me like they're trying to be the first mover and making plans to weather this global storm. And I think that is very clearly stated in the national security strategy, because it lays it out fairly plainly. The United States is creating Fortress North America and hardening the Western Hemisphere against foreign encroachment. The Trump administration is trying to secure the Western Hemisphere so that we're insulated as we can be from this change. And it seems to me to say that the Western Hemisphere can be relatively self-sufficient. We're talking about North America and South America here, but we have to start setting the conditions now. And I think that's one reason why we saw what happened with Maduro and these carrot and stick negotiations going on with Greenland. Someone's been sharing that map around on X, and it shows the Arctic and all these Russian ICBM bases. And if they were to launch nuclear weapons towards North America, especially on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., most of them fly right over Greenland. So when President Trump says Greenland is a national security imperative, that is exactly why. Now, you don't have to like how he's going about this, obviously, but what he's doing in light of the national security strategy, it's very clear why he is doing this. And it's very clear why we're trying to shape South America and, in general, harden the Western Hemisphere. So I look at this, what Ray Dalio is saying and Copeland's book and a lot of other people as well, and love him or hate him, and he's been wrong on a lot of things, but Peter Zion has also talked about this very similar thing, and he wrote this in his 2022 book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, which basically said the United States is going to be forced into retreating or retrograding back to the Western Hemisphere because eventually it's all we're going to be able to afford to defend. And so now we have the national security strategy saying, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're going to have to protect our critical supply chains outside the Western Hemisphere. But our first priority is making sure that we have Fortress North America and it is unassailable. That's another reason why I think Canada and Mexico, and I said this on X, I think they're eventually going to be brought to heel. And that's just a really crude way of stating a point that could be better stated using other words. But all this stuff between Mark Carney and China and Canada, that's the Trump administration is not going to allow that to happen. And the stuff going on with Europe and China, I mean, it's kind of it's related, but it's a different thing. But the United States just still has a massive amount of power and influence. And people say that's waning, and I obviously to some level that is true. But we still have a massive amount of weight to throw around. And that's made very clear in the national security strategy. And so people have talked a lot about the collapse of the American empire. I mean, I was making videos. Actually, when I first started Forward Observer, we started out as a digital and print magazine 10 years ago, actually a little over 10 years ago as a digital and print magazine. And we had this one issue called End of an Era. And it was about the potential for balkanization eventually, like roughly in the next 20 years or so. So a lot of people talk about the demise of the dollar and the dollar's going to zero and we're going to have economic collapse and the American empire is going to collapse and all these things and so on and so forth. But just what I want to encourage you to consider is that Pax Americana as a global condition, yes, of course, that's collapsing. That does not mean that the United States is going away. It does not mean that the dollar is going away. It means that there's a very, very good chance that we just dollarize the Western Hemisphere and we promote the use of the dollar across the Western Hemisphere as a way to create international demand. So one way to help insulate the value of the dollar, especially if lots of other countries outside the Western Hemisphere do less business in dollars. And the American empire becomes the United States becomes a hemispheric power with the ability to reach out and touch into the Eastern Hemisphere, just not with this global military presence that I've known pretty much my entire life. So consider that food for thought. All right, with that, we do have some questions, and everyone, thanks for standing by. And Jared, if you can, let's tee up the member questions because we got 43 questions this morning. If you can, grab those member questions. We'll tackle those first. All right, do you see the anti-ICE movement possibly destroying itself? There's a story going around about a software developer that was mistaken for an ICE agent that got harassed by anti-ICE protesters. Well, Robert, let's bring up something that actually did happen, which was Occupy Wall Street. And actually, we can also say BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement. Both of these things burned out for a couple of reasons. One, yes, like you go back to Occupy Wall Street, and it got cold outside, and nobody in Philadelphia or New York wanted to stay outside when it was 20 degrees. And so that's one reason why Occupy Wall Street folded. But the other reason why is because people stopped supporting the tactics of Occupy Wall Street. You had a plurality, maybe close to half the country agreeing with Occupy Wall Street's concerns about the 1% versus the 99%. But they said, yeah, I don't want to have to step over your trash and your tents walking down the street trying to get to my job. And I think Occupy Wall Street burned itself out through those very disruptive tactics. And we can say the same thing for Black Lives Matter. They burned themselves out on the writing, and Americans really dislike political violence in general, and they got tired of it. And of course, there's corruption and lots of other things. The reason why that BLM thing died out. And it also got cold outside. So is there a case where the anti-ICE movement also adopts tactics that are not popular, that tend to backfire on them, like protesting church services, and maybe the anti-ICE movement loses some support for their tactics? Oh, I think you're on mute somehow, maybe.
So I did see this video. It was at a cafe in Minneapolis where they were banging on the windows. There were some guys that were vibe coding inside or whatever that worked for a local tech company. These videos coming out of them accosting just normal people on the street and the church demonstration, I think, could backfire because what I've seen going back for the last couple of years, that some of these more disruptive tactics, like with the pro-Palestine movement, there were the airport blockades and stuff like that very quickly loses popular support. And I think there's the potential that this does have two negative outcomes for the anti-ICE movement. One, it galvanizes movement from the right, and two, it does lose them support among people who otherwise would not necessarily be strong in either direction. That's effectively the advantage that the anti-ICE groups have is that supporting a liberal cause is basically low effort. Most people in the United States would have a positive opinion of it just by default. But doing things like invading a church during services because you are claiming that the pastor is like the local ICE office field director or whatever, that has the potential to start losing support among people who otherwise by default support you. And I think that's part of why Waltz and Fry have come out saying like, hey, keep it peaceful. We don't want too much. We don't want violence. No, not just because they don't want to give a justification for the Trump administration to continue ramping up Metro Surge or even invoking the Insurrection Act, but also I think they realize that this does cut down on their broader public support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would remind everyone as well, just looking at the strategic, from what I can tell, the strategic plans of Indivisible in this broader movement, they did not want to ramp this up until March. That was going to be their No Kings 3.0. And I've been calling it kind of tongue-in-cheek, the spring offensive, where they're going to ramp up. And we're going to get into spring and summer. It's going to be a long summer again. But I think this has precipitated what they wanted to do. And we'll have a lot more to cover on that. How it's impacted their strategic view and what we could be looking at next. We'll just have to cover that later. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on to the next question, please. Does the skeptical juror training happen before or after jurors are selected? I imagine it happens before. Otherwise, that would be jury tampering, or something, right?
Correct.
And have any judges spoken out or taken any action against said jurors or instructors or the training? In the past, judges have been very harsh towards anyone even talking about jury nullification. Robert?
So yeah, it happens before. They're doing these what they call teach-ins. It's the same thing they're doing where like Democracy AID was doing with the workshops for federal employees on strategic non-cooperation. And they have, as I've looked through, I've kept an eye on Free DC's events calendar, and they have become they have started implementing more information security. Like they don't give the location of the trainings until you sign up, and you have to go through their campaigning orientation. So basically, they get to vet you before you go to these trainings. And so I have not seen any judges comment on this specifically, probably because of they're not aware of who is in these trainings. And so they're not, and I imagine they're being trained not to use the word jury nullification and not to talk about it during the jury selection process or grand jury process when they are pulled up for some of these cases.
Mm-hmm. And then for jury nullification to work, does that have to be unanimous, or can one juror hold out and basically force a mistrial or force something?
Yeah, one juror could hold out and effectively force a mistrial.
So they just need one juror. So they just need one juror on these cases. Okay.
Correct.
All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Next question, Jared. What would it look like removing the United States from Five Eyes and NATO? This is our equipment, our technology. Well, yeah. So Five Eyes, and actually let's maybe bring Robert back on. All right. Five Eyes is the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. And it's an intelligence sharing agreement. It's the Anglosphere. And like for Iraq and Afghanistan, we made a lot of intelligence, Five Eyes. We said, look, we're going to share these with our coalition partners. Some obviously more broadly, but Five Eyes is like a pretty standard release caveat for classified intelligence, or at least some classified intelligence. Robert, I'm not sure that the Five Eyes continues without the United States. I mean, we are such a large part. I mean, no one has our collection capability. And it's like taking the star quarterback off a team. Like, yeah, maybe the team continues, but you're not going to be able to pass the ball very well. And I'm not saying Five Eyes collapses because I actually don't know what those national policies would be. But we're such a large part of Five Eyes. It seems to me like maybe there would be some continued intelligence sharing. But has there been talk of the United States pulling out of Five Eyes?
I have not seen that, not from the administration.
Mm-hmm. All right. And listen, and that's not to say that these other countries don't contribute anything. They obviously do. But it's a small minority, I would imagine, and look, I left my job in 2012, so it's been almost 14 years since I've been in, but I imagine not much has changed. Next question. I'm going to do an area study. This question, is your YouTube video from 5 years still accurate, or do you have any other resources for area study work? We have any intelligence classes this year? Okay, well, just a dude. First of all, congratulations. Everyone should be doing their area study with a focus on your local political and social landscape. And you should be looking at things like the presence of radical and revolutionary groups in your area. Even if you think they don't exist, do some due diligence, get out there and look, because they may be operating under your nose. And then you can also look for like social justice and activist groups. Maybe they're not revolutionary, but they could be in the future. So I would start there, look at those, and then of course look for right-wing groups as well, obviously. So everyone should be doing their area study. My YouTube video, I think it's like 30 minutes or an hour long from 5 years ago. I think it's called How to Do an Area Study. Yes, it is still. That is still an excellent resource for doing your area study. Now, I have added a lot of information and training and kind of TTPs to that. If you want the ebook version, there is the Area Intelligence Handbook, which is a 200-page ebook that's up on Amazon currently. If you wait another week or two, I will have the next and final edition of the Area Intelligence Handbook. I've rewritten parts of it to reflect the most current training, and then also expand it. There's a few more chapters in there about collection. How do you collect open source intelligence? How do you collect imagery? How do you collect SIGINT? How do you collect HUMINT, especially? And so if you wait like another week or two, I'll have that book out, and it will also be in print as well. And that'll be up on Amazon. And as soon as we're getting ready to release it, I'll send everyone out a link so you can join an email list. So I'll let you know when that's out. And then finally, will you have any intelligence classes this year? Yeah, actually, I think I'm going to try to do one down in Florida in July. And I'm going to get to the Carolinas. And yes, I'll publish a training schedule. This will be the 3-day tactical intelligence course. So we really focus on collection and analysis. How do you gather all this information from your local area, your county, or your neighborhood level? And then how do you make an assessment? How do you figure out what's important and why? Figure out how these characteristics of your area will be positively or negatively affect your security situation. And then we focus on real-time collection and then really driving operations. So in the practical exercise on day 3, it is a low-intensity conflict scenario, but you could adapt those principles to search and rescue, towards evacuation from like a hurricane or a wildfire, or pretty much any kind of operation. Once you understand the intelligence process, for one, you can adapt it to literally any operation. Great question, Just a Dude, and I'll have a lot more to cover on that as well. Robert, will the SAVE Act get passed? I've seen a lot of conservatives say, go push your senators, give your senators a call and tell them to vote for the SAVE Act. Is it going to pass?
I saw that they are trying to push it in the House again ahead of the midterm. That would require them to end the legislative filibuster. I don't think there's enough momentum for that right now. As far as I know, there are allegedly 8 holdouts in the Senate, including John Thune, who do not want to pass the SAVE Act. They may change their mind, or they may remove the legislative filibuster, and they only need 50 plus JD Vance.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, we obviously try not to be too partisan on this show, but the Senate Majority Leader does not support the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act is that's voter ID, essentially, right? That's election security.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. And I saw where Elon Musk has been leading the charge, and it really does. I mean, what is the purpose of a democratic system if the democratic process is not secure and vulnerable to fraud? It kind of betrays the entire point of going out and voting if you're voting against a bunch of other ballots from non-citizens or non-voters. You would think that this is pretty common sense and this is something that we can all agree on, but really, I've talked about this a lot on this briefing. The breakdown in the national consensus, the elite consensus, the economic consensus, the political consensus, there are just things where we're not disagreeing on whether this thing should cost $5 million or $6 million. We're disagreeing on whether we should spend $60 billion or $0 on this thing. And it just seems like these gaps in consensus are so wide. I think a couple of weeks ago, I made the case historically, when you have these breakdowns in national consensus, and Ray Dalio would call this the breakdown of the internal order, where it's not just a disagreement of degree, it's a disagreement of kind entirely. Where typically when you have a breakdown of national consensus, typically it's going to take a conflict to reestablish that national consensus. And we've had this, obviously after the revolution and after the Civil War, where a new national consensus emerged, but it was not until after we fought over it. Robert, anything to add there?
No.
All right. Can we get an economic influence take on public opinion, thus tolerance for civil disruption in light of the latest economic good news? Is it too early? Can we get an economic? Are you asking about how public opinion influences the economy? I don't know, Dan. I guess Robert or Jared, do you have a better take on my reading of that question?
Yeah, I think he's asking about the effects of economic good news, lower inflation, reduced taxes, et cetera, on the public's tolerance for this civil disruption.
Gotcha. Yeah. So listen, we can talk about job numbers. We can definitely talk about GDP. And actually we can talk about NVIDIA's Q3 numbers, which pretty much saved the AI bubble and ensure that it will continue expanding. If AI is in fact a bubble, Goldman Sachs makes a fairly compelling case that it's not actually a bubble yet. I don't know. At any rate, The NVIDIA Q3 earnings a few months ago really saved this whole thing. And now we're talking the Atlanta GDP. The Atlanta GDP Now tracker last Friday had Q4 GDP at like 5%, 5.1% or something like that, which is pretty astounding. But guys, let's talk about, I'm not going to break down GDP numbers here, but let's just say GDP is a number. If GDP is not felt by Main Street, if you're not making more money at your job, if you're not getting more money in your pocket to go out and spend, GDP could be 10%. If the average American is not feeling the positive beneficial effects of that, it does not matter what GDP is. GDP is something for investors and bankers to look at. It has no impact whatsoever on Main Street. Average Americans do not care what GDP is if they don't have more money. So they can talk about how great the economy is. If Main Street's not feeling it, they're not going to get out and vote for the Trump economy if they're not feeling it. I think that's the bottom line. And it will probably generate far more resentment or far more anger against the Trump economy because so many wealthy people are doing well and so many 50% below are not doing well. I hope that answers your question. What do you see as the primary deals that the Trump administration wants to get out of Greenland, assuming that all his talk and rhetoric are about striking a deal? Well, Jared, I would say, he's been talking about annexing Greenland, but I think he would probably settle for having Greenland as a protectorate, or at least having Denmark relinquish some control and giving us greater operational control about what we deploy there, what assets we deploy there, and maybe the strategic direction of the country, being that they have minerals and they are geostrategically situated. Pretty classic Trump stuff. Everyone knows this. He starts at 125 so he can peel back to 100, or he starts at 200 so he can peel back to 100. That's the art of the deal. Everyone knows this by now. But he is damned and determined that we will have greater control over Greenland. How do you answer this question?
I think the only way he'd step back is what you said, where he wants greater access to it and control over what we can put up there. But that probably just comes down to a de facto complete and total control of Greenland, like he says. And he's not been shy about, hey, yeah, that's because Europe can't do it. Europe should do it, but they cannot do it. And Europe cannot do it. We've covered that extensively.
Europe, that's the latest thing. Jared, what's the latest thing? Europe said that they will not be ready to assume continental defense until 2030?
That sounds about right. Yeah.
I think it was 2030. And the Trump administration said, no, that's too long. You got to do it by 2027.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. The Trump administration, at risk of diving down a rabbit hole, we covered the national security strategy to death. It's all about hardening this hemisphere to prepare for the Pacific War. I still don't think that's going to happen, but that does not mean the administration can sit on its laurels. So it has to prepare, act like it's going to happen January 1st, 2027. That is the standard. Is we're going to war with China at that point. Everybody needs to be on point by then. Europe's not. Europe cannot do it. And that means preparing for worst case scenario of Russia decides to get involved and start launching ICBMs over the Arctic. We need to have that up and running well before 2027. That probably means moving a lot of very like THAAD and Patriot out of key areas into Greenland, and we need to make sure that they are politically reliable so that they cannot just unilaterally go, no, we want you out. I think that is the biggest thing. We have bases there, but at any point they can say, no, we don't want you here. That cannot be even an option on the table, because that allows for influence from the other two major powers.
Mm-hmm. Well, China did move the X-band radar into South Carolina, or into South Korea some years ago, and China exerted a lot of political and economic influence on South Korea, and South Korea finally relented and said, no, sorry, you can't do that here. And so we have seen this. Basically, these countries exert their national sovereignty and say, no, you actually can't deploy this military equipment here. So, Jared, I think that's a great point, that China could not somehow influence Greenland like they have other countries, eventually influence Greenland to reject U.S. military presence. I think that's Fantastic point. Next question. It seems like, Jared, did you have something else?
No, just this is right up my alley.
Okay, we'll stay on then. It seems like as the U.S. bullies its way back into Fortress America, China is filling the power vacuum that the U.S. wants help. Is the U.S. going to be able to gain new allies, or are we just going to become a diminished power?
Yeah,
well, Peter, we've heard a lot of geopolitical pundits talk about this, and there is a level of reluctance to go along with this. And even Mark Carney from the Canadian Prime Minister said last week, Jared, he said, "Oh, this new strategic cooperation deal with China is going to set us up nicely for the next world order." And so this is obviously, I mean, I think a lot of these countries really do look at the global situation and see a choice between the United States and Canada. And if you remain if you hope to be any power whatsoever, you probably cannot remain unaligned, because supply chains are so important to your economy. And so few of these countries produce what they need. They've got to get it from abroad. And so it's going to be either from US aligned countries or China aligned countries. And I just don't see a lot of space for neutrality here. If you want to have a functioning economy and remain a regional power, you just can't, you don't have the juice to do it. So Robert, Jared, I think that actually is forcing some of these countries to take a good hard look and say, China is probably more, I'm just telling you from their perspective. Xi Jinping is a more stable leader than President Trump. We don't even know who's going to be the president in another 3 years. Some of these countries may be questioning whether we will even continue to have elections in this country. And that, I think maybe that's part of their perspective. And then I think there's probably, they just dislike Trump. They're many of these leaders are globalists. They do not like nationalist leaders, definitely not in America. And they don't want to go along with nationalism, because that, if America exerts its nationalist power, that's probably going to embolden these nationalist movements in their own countries, and maybe they will be ejected from power. So I think I think that's one major thing that's going on. Also, I think there's a very good question of whether democracy, as we've known it, will actually continue to function in the 21st century. This is something that back in 21 or so, then President Biden recounted this conversation that he had with Xi Jinping, and he said, he told me that democracy will not work in the 21st century because it takes too long to form consensus. And when the national consensus is breaking down in the United States here, which it is, the political, social, economic, elite consensus has broken down, or is in the last half of breaking down. You do have to start to ask, well, can a democratic process reestablish this consensus so that we all agree on enough to do what needs to be done? And I don't think it can. I don't think it will. So I think there's also, they're looking at it from that angle as well. If the democratic process does break down in the United States and these countries, I don't know. I think that's maybe one thing they're thinking of. Jared, what say you?
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right. It is somewhat existential for the European ruling class as they are. And part of that has got to be the national security strategy. We keep coming back to it, but he says it was international organizations that infringe upon national sovereignty. That's the EU. That is the EU in totality. It insists on putting its unelected bureaucrats into, well, somewhat elected bureaucrats into power and overriding any kind of national sovereignty. And only Hungary and Poland have remained the part of the EU, but also told them no. That's going to end up, and they're losing, by the way. Poland is losing. They're fighting, but they're losing. That the idea of, we need to have a reassertion of national sovereignty it necessitates getting rid of the EU. So yes, that is existential for them. I do think that you're right that some of the stuff that we're seeing very recently is just personal, because it's power versus power. The Carney stuff, I think there's a very personal element to that. Just some of the stuff with the transgender issue. Trump saying that right to his face when Carney's got a transgender kid. Yeah, I think that was personal. The Keir Starmer stuff, I think this was personal. But as far as will the U.S. actually gain new allies or become a diminished power, I don't think we're becoming a diminished power whatsoever. I think you're about to see a hard. I think you're about to see the U.S. Let me back that up. America is going to become a hardened power whether or not the U.S. is still the governing system of America. It will gain new allies. That's part of the national security strategy. It's not just, oh, well, hey, we want everybody else to do things. No, that it explicitly says we want to build you up into being appropriately powerful national entities. That way you're reliable allies. That is building an empire with actual good allies to lean upon and allow you to be the force multiplier to any particular region. That's what we've been documenting here at Forward Observe for 3 years now over in the Pacific. And Europe, if they would get on board, doesn't necessarily have to even, we don't have to see the end of NATO and Five Eyes. If Europe were to take the pill and just say, okay, got it, we need to build up. We need to actually step up and understand that we need to play to national sovereignty. We have to do it. That or capitulate to China, capitulate to Russia. They have to choose a superpower, or Europe will remain a diminished power. And I think it's worth considering that there may be a new power coming out of South America. I don't think it will be Brazil, but I think we could see some, with all of this buildup and then the crackdown on the cartels there, we could see something actually form in the next couple of decades that is a true new pole of power in the South. Mm-hmm. I don't think it will rival the United States, though.
Oh, yeah, definitely not. You did bring up an important point, something that I've also seen others say, is that basically the United States has not been trying. Like, we have not really been exerting our will like we could have been, because we've had a string of weak presidents. And so I've seen people say, well, we're now actually seeing America exert its power abroad, and the world doesn't really like that. But ultimately, the world should not have a say in our own national security. So, all right. I guess this is what the U.S. looks like when we're trying. All right. And let me also say this. These other countries cannot exist as they exist today without the United States, but we can exist without them. And I think that is the bottom line probably of what's going on. That's just the reality. At what point does the Trump administration get tired of the political activist judges and jury nullification and switch to military tribunals? Well, I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but Robert, we have seen the Bukele option being floated, and Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador. You cannot hope to save your country if you do not combat and remove these activist judges. There's obviously no political will for impeachment of any of these judges, and it seems like there's probably not a lot of political recourse that will happen, or judicial recourse. I'm just going to go ahead and guess that extrajudicial recourse is not on the table either. So I doubt this is going to happen without some kind of cataclysmic event. If we do stumble into an actual armed domestic conflict, then the likelihood of this being done extrajudicially increases substantially. But what say you?
Yeah, I think currently very unlikely. And I think, like you said, it would require basically the anti-ICE Trump resistance groups to declare armed resistance that may
develop into an actual insurgency.
Like, yeah, it would require that before you would see any kind of military tribunals, because there's no other path to that, in our system.
Mm-hmm. One big reason. So let's just back up real quick. A lot of these groups, yes, there is some far left presence out there, obviously, but a lot of these groups are rank and file progressives, and they're not revolutionary in the sense that they want to topple the U.S. government. They want to topple Trump and take over themselves. They're reformists, not really revolutionaries. They don't want to abolish the government. They want to take over the government and reshape it in their image. Whereas your Antifas and some of these other revolutionary groups actually just want to abolish the government. And so, being that these progressive groups, and we're really talking about the establishment, indivisible is the establishment left. It is not the far left. The far left will tell you that they are not indivisible. Is not them. They want to maintain conditions beneath the threshold of armed conflict. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, they're far weaker. They're way outgunned. That's one reason. The second reason is you go back to the original color revolution strategy, like the actual doctrinal materials written by Gene Sharp and some of these other NGOs. And they say that they choose color revolutions because they tend to be quick, relatively painless compared to armed conflict, and they are executed with the least amount of human suffering. And you go back and you just look at the history of insurgencies. On average, they last 10 years. So one way I look at that average of 10 years is, say, this is not actual statistics, but you just say half of them last 5 years, half of them last 20 years. And that's how you arrive at an average of 10 years. 10 years is a long time to be in. I mean, you know, Robert, you spent time in the Middle East. I did. Lots of our viewers did. You know, that 1 year at times seemed like it was going to last forever. And that was just a 10 or 11th month deployment. Even my last deployment as a contractor is 18 months long. And now it's almost 10 times that. And that's, you know, what we're looking at. And there's just no appetite to do that in the United States. So that's another reason why the left does not want to fight a 5 or 10 or 20 year long armed conflict. They will certainly lose that. So, you know, I see all these people talking about, oh, the United States is going to descend into civil war and this is an insurgency. You look, doctrinally, it's not an insurgency. And you look at what these people are training for and what they're doing. There are some leftist groups that are arming up and training, and they have been doing that since 2016. Like Socialist Rifle Association is one of them. And there's a bunch of gun groups on the left also. But that's a tiny fraction, a tiny, tiny fraction of the overall, of the broader establishment left, which is not doing any of that stuff. That's not to say that they won't do that stuff once they get into power, but we are talking about how they come into power. And they are not going to come into power through an armed revolution. Not in this country, not with the right being as it stands, even though I think many people on the right are feckless and living in fantasy world. So at any rate, Robert, do you have any other thoughts to add there?
Yeah, I think it's an effective way to conceptualize this is for both basically going above the threshold for armed conflict introduces so much risk for both the right and the left. And the spectrum here is basically the idea is to establish that line of what is above and below the threshold of armed conflict. And one side is going to want to push that line down to restrict the acceptable activities that the other side can do, and vice versa. The side that is attempting to build up a color revolution attempt wants to expand that spectrum of acceptable activities by pushing that line upward, making it so that in order to do something like invoke the Insurrection Act or something that is much more blatant military activity, they could do more things before it comes to that point, because for both sides it introduces a very high level of risk, not just risk of defeat, but a higher risk of disruption and destruction and civilian deaths. And that's really, I think, a good way to conceptualize this push and pull, is that there's a spectrum. That line is very bright, but the fight isn't over saying we're going to, once you get to this line and cross this line, then we're going to crack down. The fight is over pushing that line back and forth to restrict or open up acceptable activities.
Robert, I think that's a great point. One part of that I did not make previously is the average insurgency lasts 10 years. A color revolution, once you hit that trigger in the execution phase, is typically over in weeks to months. So if you can execute a color revolution that coincides with the election, and listen, if a Democrat wins in November 28, there doesn't need to be a color revolution. We're not going to see one. If a Republican wins for any reason, legitimate or illegitimate, there's a very good chance we do see an attempt at a color revolution. And again, once you build up, there is, Robert, as you say, there is a spectrum. It's called the escalation ladder. And once you have built up, it's really hard to go from the first rung to the 10th rung. And that's why they go up one rung at a time. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I've talked about them many times on this briefing. But I would just add, I'm not a physician, but just as a crude analogy, okay, if your heart is weak, your doctor may say, start with eating right and exercising. We're not going to go do open heart surgery on you. There's things that you can do to get your heart healthier rather than something that's extremely invasive. And that is the distinction between what we're seeing now versus an actual insurgency or armed domestic conflict. There's just no reason, I think, from their perspective right now, there's no reason to try to resort to that. And that, anyway, we'll leave it there for now. Jared, let's do one other question because we've been going for an hour and a half already. And we'll save the rest for tomorrow. Jared, pick out maybe the best question that you can find, and we'll end on that one. All right, can we achieve a sufficient consensus, or do we want non-democracy based government? Well, listen, that is, we don't editorialize, and we certainly don't forecast or we don't promote certain courses of action. It's not our job as intelligence people. Our job as intelligence people is to describe the conditions as they exist today and conditions that we expect in the future. And this is a moral, philosophical, operational question, not really an intelligence question. So, I would just say what we have in the United States is an aberration of history. It is not the historical norm. The post-1945, even though there were hot wars and cold wars, that is still not the historical average. And I think what we're seeing now is a reversion to the mean. And this was an exceptional period of human history. Maybe it will get better eventually, but I think it will get far worse before it gets better. And I think what we're seeing now here is probably a reversion to the mean for a little while. And with AI and all this stuff, I mean, who knows? Who knows what happens from here? But I would say, I tell you, I see a lot of people on the far left, obviously, and on the far right flirting with this non-democratic solution, non-voting solution. And I think it's easy to look at the fruits of mass democracy, and I think that causes a lot of people to have some doubts, and it causes them to take a second look. Man, do I want to give this encumbrance to my children or to future generations? And it's a question that they have to ask and decide for themselves. We can't decide that for you, obviously. All right, everyone, we really appreciate your support, and we're here Monday through Friday at 08 Central Time. We talk about the day's issues and where we think the country's headed. This week we have we're going to start beta testing the new Forward Observer news and intelligence platform. We have a lot of open source intelligence tools that we're going to give you so that we can continue to maintain an eye on what's happening at the national and global level, but push these tools down to the local level so that you can start doing assessments for your county or for your neighborhood or your state level and figure out what's going on. Because ultimately, whether we go to war with China or get into war with Russia or get into war with ourselves, it matters far less what's happening on the national strategic level when you have threats on your doorstep or in your neighborhood or in your county. And you as the viewer, you have to deal with those direct effects. What happens out your front doorstep, down your driveway, down your street, in and around your neighborhood and community, that's your tactical environment. And we can maintain the national strategic picture and tell you where we think you're headed. But ultimately, we can't do that for you in your neighborhood. Only you can do that. That's the reason why we're building the system. So we can give you the tools to help you do that, the tools and the training. So head over to forwardobserver.com/trial, sign up for a free 7-day trial. You'll start receiving our report via email in the morning. And then also by the end of this month, we will have this new, we'll be at initial operating capacity. We'll continue to build out tools in anticipation still of March being kind of D-Day for the beginning of this spring offensive in the summer. Maybe another summer of love. We'll see. All right, everyone, thanks so much for joining us. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.